Well, welcome, friends, to this brave new world where Twinkies and Dolly Madison cupcakes are no longer available. The combination of the legalization of marijuana in a couple of states and the absence of Twinkies has thrown a number of stoners into absolute panic. And yet, together, we must march on, no? Personally, I've always been suspicious of any food that you can buy and put on your shelf and then eat it 2 weeks or 2 years later, and it tastes exactly the same. But the disappearance of items like this from convenience store shelves is probably good for the public health. But I got to tell you, I'm angry about the classically dishonest way that the failure of Hostess bakeries has been portrayed in the news. Our age has become so pro-corporation and so anti-worker that we seem to be willing to believe even the most blatant of anti-union rhetoric from our corporately owned media. Yeah, the employees of Hostess bakeries who earn less than $20 an hour went on strike. And the reason they went on strike is because corporate executives had given themselves raises of between 60 and 100%, and the CEO had increased his salary by 300%, while they were simultaneously trying to cut the salaries of the people that made less than $20 an hour by 8%, and to cut their health insurance and pension benefits by 30%. Just before they declared bankruptcy, these executives borrowed $160 million from the workers' pension holdings, money that will not have to be paid back to their pension holdings if the bankruptcy is granted. And yet, the media tells us that it was these poor, low-salaried workers that drove Hostess out of business. I'm often reminded of Lily Tomlin saying that no matter how cynical I get, I just can't keep up. The morning news this week included a very one-sided series of reports on the war along the border of the Gaza Strip and Israel. A handsome, blonde Israeli reporter with a very American accent spoke forcefully on CNN about the bombing of a bus in Tel Aviv in which 15 people were tragically killed. The reporter went on to say that the terrorist bombing was being celebrated in Gaza, with adults handing out candy to children and joyous reveling at the deaths of these innocent civilians. He told us that the Israelis try to avoid civilian deaths when they strike in Gaza, but Hamas militants actually target Israeli civilians. They would have us to believe that Palestinians are morally bankrupt, if not entirely subhuman. What is missing from the mainstream media is any kind of honest description of the imbalance of the conflict in Gaza. There are 1.5 million people who live in Gaza. It is basically an open-air prison. They are surrounded on all sides. Their access to health care, employment, and even importation of necessary goods is all limited and controlled by Israel and Egypt. But everyone who lives in Gaza is not a member of Hamas. They've been under a blockade for 2 years, and only 2 young reporters who happen to live in Gaza have been able to tell us anything about what goes on there. Yes, there are offenses on both sides, there are, but the reporting is anything but honest. There are people firing missiles, and they probably got the missiles from Iran. That's probably true. You cannot, however, buy those on eBay. What they don't have in Gaza is a navy. They don't even have access to a port. What they do not have in Gaza is an air force, while they are daily harassed by F-16 fighter jets that have heavy artillery. Hamas stoops to terrorism, but given the military might of Israel, this is not a war. It's more like murder. You'll not hear that said on CNN or ABC or NBC, and I doubt that you'll hear it in a Methodist, Presbyterian, or Catholic pulpit. But don't assume that I'm overstating the facts. They are understating the facts, and they are distorting the information. I'm not trying to be anti-Israeli. I count myself among those people who fell in love with Israel the first time I visited it. The city of Jerusalem is a place that I care for a great deal. And over the 30 years since I first visited there, I have been back, and I still have passionate feelings about it. But people, there are numbers. Beyond passionate feelings, there's math. Facts are not conservative or liberal. Math is not pro-Israel or pro-Palestine. Even counting that bus bombing, there have been fewer than 20 Israeli deaths in this current exchange of missiles and more than 100 deaths in Gaza. And yeah, sure, they are targeting military sites, but what that very handsome reporter tells us about Israel only targeting military sites is that among those 100 casualties, there were 24 children and 10 women. So they're not doing a real good job of targeting military sites. Those are facts. Ibrahim Shatali, a training officer in Gaza for the American Society of Friends, who's teaching in a Palestinian youth program trying to teach peace, wrote a letter to the Society of Friends this week in which he says, "My father sought refuge in Gaza after being forced to leave Magdal in 1948. He was only 12 years old when he accompanied his parents to what he thought was going to be a safer place. Today, we have to go to a funeral at my cousin's, who lost his 4-year-old twins, along with other adult members of his family. It's very sad. I live in my family's home, together with my 5 brothers, their wives, and offspring. You're talking about moving a human mass of 30 children towards the stairway every time an explosion is heard in our vicinity. The Islamic National Bank was targeted this morning, and it is only 500 meters from our home, 150 meters from the Society of Friends office where the peace training is done. Every day, the series of explosions begins at 6 p.m. and escalates until 6 a.m., at which time we try to steal some hours of sleep. No one is exempt from this terrifying experience. What you need to understand is there are people growing up in Gaza who sleep in a bunker every night, not soldiers, children, because the bombing goes on from sunset until sunrise every day. Israel has the big weapons, and pro-Israeli interests own most of the big media. But you own the truth, and no one can take it away from you unless you willingly give in to the empire. Our scripture lesson this morning comes from that dramatic confrontation in John's account of Jesus' trial before Governor Pilate. Now, a lot of progressive scholars tend to be very dismissive about John's gospel. It's written long after the actual events. It shows little sign of being concerned about history. If you want to know what Jesus of Nazareth said and did, most scholars would tell you that there's not more than 2 lines in John that would give you any insight. But of course, you don't come to church for a history lesson. I hope you don't, because you're not going to get much of one. Most gospel accounts are not historical. The Gospels are sermons. The Gospels tell stories that employ metaphor and similes and parables. Some of my students in my university classes object loudly that if they're not historically accurate, why do we bother reading them? It's a very modern kind of concern. We tend at times in the modern era to be very fact literal about things without an appropriate concern for what is meaningful. How do you understand life? How do you interpret ethics? That's what the Gospels are about. They were never intended to be newsreels. The Gospel writers, and this is especially true of John, were not so concerned with filling the later church in on historical details. They wanted to convey the message, the moral, the meaning of the Jesus movement. John isn't showing us a photograph of Jesus in front of Pilate. He's painting a word picture. It's an image of a poor, uneducated, tortured, powerless peasant standing in front of the heavily armed, very powerful representative of the empire that at that time ruled and owned the world. And the people who looked at this image that John painted already knew how it was going to end. They knew that the powerful empire would murder the peasant in the most painful way imaginable. The empire would seek to make an example of this poor man, nailing him up onto a post by a major road, just like you would put up a billboard sign that reads, "This is what happens to anyone who defies the economy or the power of the empire." And yet Jesus is defiant, unafraid, it seems. The way John wants us to see it, Jesus is the powerful one. Because when all the blood is dried and the crosses are gone, nobody gets together to sing hymns to Pilate. No one tells Pilate stories. No one defines their lives as being followers of Pilate. The empire murdered the peasant. But look at us. 2,000 years later, we're still talking about the peasant in a million houses of worship all over the globe. But still, the metaphors of the Gospels are not written to make you look at Jesus and say, wow. Here's the truth of the matter. These stories are not historically true because what would it matter if they were or they weren't? They are morally true. And not as stories about great martyrs who deserve for us to immortalize their names and build statues in their memory. Men and women, these stories are not ultimately about Jesus. Jesus had been dead for 3 generations when John picked up a pen. The story is about the Jesus community, the followers of Jesus, the disciples of Jesus that continued to stand up to the empire. This isn't about what happened. It's about what can happen if you can do it tomorrow. The gospel isn't buried in the past. It's buried in your heart. When the empire asks you to believe a lie, to be passive in the presence of violence and bloodshed, it asks you to stand up for the truth, to stand up with the poor who are being fired from their jobs, whose pensions are being taken from them, whose homes are being foreclosed. It asks you to stand up for the people who are being denied access to health care or housing, all in the name of religion that is a religion of profit. This story isn't about Jesus in a historical sense. The story is intended for you in this word picture to see yourself standing up in front of the empire and for you to get ready before it happens. The real Christian religion has always been about orthopraxy and not orthodoxy. The empire always wants religions to turn into orthodoxy. It's about what you believe that exists only between your ears, because that religion never threatens the empire. That religion ultimately serves the empire. I often call traditional Christianity the religion of Constantine because he's largely responsible for inventing it. The religion the emperor demanded that everyone follow, as they squashed every other kind of Christianity that existed in the 4th century. But that religion doesn't follow Jesus. Ultimately, that religion worships Pilate and everything Pilate represented. The religion of the domination of the weak, of veneration of military and economic power. Our religion, our faith, our practice is to stand up before the empire, even if we are armed only with the truth. As Gandhi said in his battle with the empire that oppressed his people, first they ignore us, then they make fun of us, then they fight us, and then we win. In the case of Jesus, there may be one more step. First they ignore us, then they make fun of us, then they fight us, then they torture and kill us. But still, then we win.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.